Awesome. And we're live. Thanks everybody for coming to another NPM Open RFC call. Today's date is Wednesday, August 18th, 2021. We'll be following along in the agenda that was posted in issue 435 in the NPM RFC's repo. As usual, we ask folks to please abide by the code of conduct in these calls. Please be respectful and raise your hand when others are speaking, and I'll try to call on you and hopefully have a good discussion. I want to open up the floor for folks if there's any announcements that anybody had. Nothing to share. As normal, our team is constantly shipping weekly releases. So if you haven't, feel free to grab the latest version of the NPM CLI. We'll be cutting another version tomorrow. Thursdays are our weekly release days. So yeah, that's the only announcement I had on my side. As I noted, we'll be following along in the agenda, and here's a link to the meeting notes. The first item, we'll jump right in unless there's anything else that folks had to share. The first item is PR 434. This is an RFC essentially denoting having v7, have some sort of mechanism for defining the package lock it supports. I know, Jordan, I saw you just jumped on. You were one of the few people that I think looked through this and gave some feedback. I'm not sure if you want to.
Which one?
This is PR 434. This is the supporting package lock JSON v3 in NPM 7. Essentially, it's the idea that not having sort of a backwards compatible implementation for package locks, explicitly defining what package lock the CLI is supporting. I think in some of the discussion, they even outline, and I'll copy the comment here, that there might be an opportunity to reuse package lock to define the specific version of the schema that it supports. I think a synopsis here is they are concerned about the bloat of supporting both the V1 and the V2 format. Is essentially the goal behind this.
The issue here is that they have, they know that they're using NPM 7 and above, so they are never going to be reading from the dependencies sort of backwards compatibility block in the package lock file, and would prefer to have a file that's half the size and make it so that changes only have to be reviewed once. This is pretty straightforward to do. I think the suggestion that it be pivot based on the engines.npm value is probably going to be trickier than it seems, just because then we're having to kind of detect, we're inferring a config value based on the overlap of potentially two Semver ranges, right? If yeah, so that just gets kind of hairy and gets it out of the, like, either it should be based on the engine's npm value, or it should be based on a config value and not inferring a config value based on engine's npm. Yeah, it's my take, but yeah, if we just add a package lock version field, lock file version field, it would be pretty straightforward to do.
Any other feedback, comments, Jordan?
I'm not sure if my audio is working now, but I was saying just like NPM selects the best possible hashing algorithm, it doesn't require that to be configured. It seems reasonable to select the best possible lock file.
Good point.
Like I just don't understand the resistance to inference for the default. I completely understand why we wouldn't want a user's explicit config value to be interfered with by inference. But in the lack of an explicit config value, it seems like inference is a nice thing to do.
It seems that way, but here's the here's the rub of it. It's not like the engines.npm field is a semver range. And so then what you're suggesting is we have a config value whose default is based on whether that semver range intersects with anything less than 7, which is just more complicated than I prefer config defaults to be. You know, it's
Is there a reason to not to do it besides your preference?
well, there's a reason for the preference, which is having complicated config defaults is almost always a pain. Like, yes, npm does infer a lot of things, and it's kind of a problem that we infer so many things. It opens the door for a lot of very difficult to reason about code, which we then have to maintain. And just having it be, you know, based on an explicit config with a hard-coded default is super, super simple. You know, it just means that there's only one thing we need to look at to know what it should be doing.
Right. But
So
what
yeah.
happens if I put lock file version 3 and then someone runs npm 6 on it? That'll just be silently ignored, right?
No, npm 6 will say, I don't understand this lock file format. I was built to work with lock file version 1, but I will do my best with it. Then it will proceed to not see anything in the lock file and just do a lock-free install.
But that's if there's an existing lock file that specifies version 3. I get that. I'm saying there's no lock file. My npm RC has lock file version 3 in it, and then I type npm install. What version will it create the lock file in npm 6 versus 7? I'm assuming 1 and 3.
That's correct. 6 will always create a version 1 lock file because it's the only thing it knows how to do.
Right. So that seems more confusing to me in the sense that, like, with the engines.npm field, I can't run into that situation because I can't have npm 6 or 7 lacks this feature.
Well, all the more reason why npm 9 should crash when it sees a config value that it doesn't understand, because this is, this is a
I mean, I think that's a great. I mean, npm 8 even maybe, but yeah, I agree with that. But given the situation we are now, like, I think that's worth considering.
Yeah, Gar, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
I just want to talk to the inference. One of the hard-won lessons of NPM is guessing user intent is always wrong. There needs to be a compelling reason versus, oh, why not? It's not why not, it's compelling. This is why we should absolutely guess the user intent here, because historically it has always been a nightmare, because the user base is so big and the intent never covers everything. So that's, inference is actively something we're fighting as a legacy. So yeah, it would need to be a compelling reason to do it rather than why not.
Well, yeah, and so I hear that argument. I'm more saying that if someone has put engines npm and specified an npm 7 high enough that this feature is supported, like, I agree that it's not harmful to create a lock file version 2. And so that's a reason why not to infer it. But it seems like it matches their intent to create a lock file version 3, since they already want to force compatibility with those and that npm range.
Right. So I think just to add a little bit of color to what Gar is saying, like, I agree, it has always been a nightmare. There are a handful of cases where I think the nightmare was worth it. I think inferring color and not showing color by default if you're on a non-TTY output, probably a good thing. A lot of Unix tools do that. It's also a huge pain that has been a real hassle to deal with in a lot of situations. So, it's a higher cost than it looks like. I agree with you. If you said npm, your engines.npm is like 7 or greater, that's fine. Yes, like, that is a statement of intent that, you're not going to be using a version of npm that's lower than 7. However, that doesn't stop somebody from installing your project with npm 6. And if we then installed something different than what the lock file is, we're now violating a contract. So
Wait, I
unless we
thought
go
it
back
did
in
stop.
time, no, unless it'll stop it being installed as a dependency of something else.
Oh, I was under the, I'm sorry, I was under the impression that the super strict engines.npm special behavior also applied to the app use case. You're saying it only applies to the package use case.
Correct.
Okay, that changes my advice completely, because the primary value to me is in the app use case here. So I have no more interest in inference in this particular case. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, I mean, that's maybe something that we should get, that we should do. We don't do that in npm 7 either. You can put engines.npm equals 9999 in your package JSON and still install the project. But yeah, I think just if we don't have basically like a profound reason to infer something, like, you know, it will be a security problem, or, you know, it's what every other Unix tool does. So it's very unexpected for it not to infer in this particular case. Like, we should not be inferring user input user intent if we can get away with it.
I mean, as a general policy thing, I sort of agree with that as a philosophy, but it's more, I was also thinking about the web's form ideology of priority of constituencies, meaning like things matter. The users are the most important ones, and like spec authors are the least important, and implementers are somewhere in there. And so like, if it's valuable to users, it shouldn't necessarily matter if it's complicated for NPM authors. But like, yeah, I mean, it's like a different argument in that case, but
yeah,
but
no,
I generally agree with your philosophy. I
think there's some sense in that, but also implementing features where we're inferring user intent, and this is getting somewhat meta, like this is bigger than just what kind of lock file we create, but implementing features where we're inferring user intent opens the door for us to infer that intent incorrectly, which does actually end up harming users. Like this is a case where we ought to be looking out for them by not guessing what they meant.
Okay, so just to circle back, what are the actions moving forward? Do we want to move forward with introducing a package lock version config?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Review, let's say the action is have review review.
I'll write up a pointer of like where they need to go in Arborist to implement this.
There'll probably be CLI changes too. That value is hard coded in the CLI. Arborist should be exporting that.
Well, if it's configurable, yeah, it shouldn't be hard coded.
Okay.
But if it's
the
configurable,
Arborist should export that as me thinking from before this discussion.
Should have been, yeah. But yeah, if I think Arborist does export that somewhere, I'm not sure. But at the very least, yeah, if it's configurable, then we just need to say like there are, you know, it could be either 1, 2, or 3. We just need to define the config. That's all the class should do, and then should pass it along.
So I took some notes there, a couple actions as well. Want to move along here, and I see Jordan would love to get to some terminology on workspaces. I know we can circle back on that. There was an item that I removed that I can re-add to the end here. So hopefully if we get some time. So yeah, moving along, RFC issue number 427, npm RC file improvements. This is by Evan Carroll, who I don't think was able to jump on today. So I think you had provided some feedback here, Isaac. This is somewhat related to Luke's the next RFC. But was wondering if you want to expand on the feedback you gave.
Yeah. Basically, I think we need to just say no on this particular RRFC. I was keeping it open because there is some value in here. I think we've sort of talked about. So first of all, our config layer is a little bit of a god-awful mess, I think is the technical term. There's some other less savory technical terms which might also apply to it. It's the kind of thing that evolves organically over a decade, and it creates a lot of features along the way. So we need to make some big breaking changes to it. While we're doing that, we can also, I mean, one of the biggest areas that is a real challenge to work with and just very confusing is the way that we kind of specify certain configs per registry. And we also allow you to specify a registry per scope. And it's done in a way that's both too flexible and too limiting at the same time. And it has a very weird syntax. It's a little bit unfortunate. So if we're going to make the kind of change that's proposed in this RRFC, we're going to have to also make some very significant changes to the way that we handle config. And if we're going to do that, well, hell, let's go all the way and really do that. You know, let's get rid of save dev, save optional, save peer. Let's make it so that unknown flags will actually crash, or invalid values will actually crash instead of just ignoring them and using the defaults. And honestly, the lowest, from my point of view, the lowest priority item would be, let's replace INI with something else. INI is weird. Git uses it, NPM uses it. Almost no other dev tool out there today uses the INI format. But it can do everything that we're talking about and has a kind of nice effect that everything is a string when it's parsed out of INI, which makes it sort of very similar to the values that we get out of the CLI arguments or the environment, which are again always strings. So, you know, being able to put null in there as an actual null value is not that much of a value because we have to handle strings no matter what. That being said, like, okay, if we want to have two different registries for a given scope, right? So we want to have one registry that's used for publishing a scope and doing any writes, and another registry that's used just for installing from that scope. That seems completely reasonable to me. Let's fold that into our bigger config plans that we're planning. Like, I don't think it needs to be, I think doing it as a one-off is going to be just as much a breaking change, and we should try to get more value out of that breaking change.
So I forget if we said last week, because I think this was on the docket as well, whether or not we were just going to, as you're saying, like pull this into a larger RFC for updating our config strategy. Like, what's the action item here? Is just close this and keep a reference to this thread, or like until we open another RFC, we keep this open?
Certainly, we should keep it on the agenda. Or sorry, take off the agenda label. We should not keep it on the agenda. There's a bit of a sprawling conversation there about TOML, and I don't know.
Are you okay with taking the action to circle back with some commentary from this discussion and then potentially closing it?
Yeah, sure.
Or leaving it, or potentially leaving it open, and then just we can close it once we open up an RFC for like essentially config.
Yep. I added a new label, config, and put it on it so we can easily find anything that we tag between now and then that's sort of config related.
Moving on then, unless other folks had comments. Let's see, hands. To issue number 423. This is the formatting of package JSON based on config values. This was written by Luke Karras from our team. Luke, did you want to give a quick synopsis of what this is all about?
Yeah, this is to enforce consistent writing of package JSON and package lock files from a set of new config values. So the config values do indentation, end of line, also sorting keys, placement of top level keys, sorting of child keys, and things like that. And it adds a new top level command that would, that's responsible for formatting those manually, and then also would write these based on the config values if you ran things that are already writing the package JSON, like install or init. And then there's what else? There's kind of some complexity in how we make this not a breaking change. So currently, I was thinking that would use the config values if they exist, and if they don't exist, it would use editor config. Or if they don't exist, it would use whatever's in package JSON, then fall back to editor config, and then fall back to some new default values, which are what they are currently, 2 spaces for tabs and a new line for end of line.
I think anytime,
Go ahead.
I think anytime we're writing a file, package lock or package JSON, we should always use what's in that file. Like unless there's an explicit command that says, please reformat this file for me. In which case it would read it, re-encode it with the defaults, and then write it back.
Yeah, so I think that's what's being introduced.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jordan.
Yeah, so this is relevant to the immediately preceding discussion about inference. Obviously, when the explicit things are present, we're good, right? Everything's fine. But I think that the very compelling reason here is that a lot of projects do specify an editor config. Especially if you're using tabs, because without an editor config, Git will display your tabs on the web as 8 spaces. But if you have an editor config, GitHub will respect it and display the tabs as the appropriate non-obscenely long spaces or indentation levels. So it's very common, especially with people who have tabs. And yeah, so I think reading from that is the appropriate thing. And exactly as Garas just said, editor config is very explicit. As far as reading from current package JSON, that's what it already does. So that's not new inference. That's the existing one. It's, but I think that it makes sense to prioritize the existing format over editor config, because if both are present, the users probably very intentionally kept them different. If both are present and differ, rather, the users probably intentionally kept them different. So I really like the sort of 4 options here presented, which is npm config rules all, and then absent that, look at package JSON, and maybe it was only 3. I don't have it in front of me. And then absent, if there's not already a package JSON file, look at editor config. And if none of the, the 4th one is if none of those are present, then you can just use the current defaults. That seems great to me.
Well, I was actually suggesting something slightly different, which is when we run npm install and we're editing package JSON as a result, right? If the current file and also same goes for a log file, if the current file being edited already exists, then use what's already in it, regardless of what the config says or the editor config says. Don't even look for those values. If we're creating it from scratch, whether that's for output --JSON or npm init or an install where there was no lock file, that kind of thing, then use the config value. And if the config value is not set, then look in editor config. And if that's not there, then use the default. So essentially editor.editor config is in the project is like a config value, a config file just for this one value. That sort of simplify things, I don't think that we should format package lock.json the same as package.json or use package.json as a source of those values, because then we do get into kind of inferring what the user meant. If they want it to be different, they could set it different.
Well, okay. So the first half of what you said, you were saying that you think that the existing format should win. Is that right?
For the existing format for the file being edited should win.
Yeah.
We should.
So
because
that
the thing is, if I do npm install foo and you rewrite the entire file, that's annoying, right?
Sure.
Like I want to see the one line diff. It should look like you opened the file, added that one line, and then close the file, not like you
so
read the
npm
file.
Already. Actually, yeah, that's true. This is what it used to do before it respected tabs and the existing stuff. It always rewrote the entire file.
Right.
And it like sorted the dependencies. I don't know if it still does that or not. So it, like npm has never been very careful about avoiding git churn on npm install foo, like diff churn. But that's interesting because my primary use case is I have nothing validating the current indentation of my package JSONs. I have hundreds of projects. I probably have a few that have mixed tabs and spaces just because I don't have them set to display in my editor as like symbols. So like what I would want is to be able to set in my user level npm-rc my preferred indentations. And then the next time I'm interacting with that project, I absolutely would want to see that larger diff. And if I saw it, what I would do is I would reset back to before I ran my command. I would run npm package format or whatever the equivalent was, or I'd just type npm install. I would commit that, and then I would rerun npm install foo and like see the small diff I wanted. So like I actually have the use case that I want it into implicitly and greedily reformat to sort of correct what is likely to be a bunch of sloppiness since it was never enforced before.
The good news is you think that we respect tabs and spaces in package JSON, but actually npm still just reads the file, parses it, makes a bunch of changes to the data object, and then re-encodes it and writes it back. The difference is now when we first read the file, we just look at what's the first line ending and what's the first indentation and use that. So we're always making it consistent, like self-consistent, which as of yet, nobody's complained about. Nobody is like prefers mixed tabs and spaces or anything like that, comma first package JSONs or what have you. But yeah, it does. I think if you want it to be different, like if you have a project that uses tabs, but you really prefer spaces or whatever, you would have to run an explicit command, npm format package.json or something, and then that would open it, rewrite it with your configs, irrespective of what's in the file.
So I think that's in this discussion, right? So Luke's outlined essentially that npm pkg has a new subcommand format, I believe is in there.
Mm-hmm.
So like, is there, in terms of like how we move forward with this, like are folks interested? Like, do we turn this into actual RFC?
Yeah, or just a feature, just a PR.
Yeah. Okay. We don't necessarily need to push it to the end.
Well, either way, I think a new format command is nice, right? Like that seems good. And having config flags that. Go ahead.
Be a subcommand under PKG. That'd be fine.
Yeah, I don't care exactly like how it's reached or spelled, right? But like just some invocation that forcibly reformats my package JSON. But personally, I would also want the lock file. I want them to always match. If package JSON is tabs, I want lock file to be tabs and same with spaces. But like having the explicit command is nice. Having config for it is sort of necessary. Otherwise, I have to go in and like guess the heuristic and edit the file and then run the format command, which that sucks. But I guess I appreciate that what npm is already doing is cleaning up the inconsistency. But like I would still want, I still would want the explicit config to overwrite inferring what's already there. I mean,
Yep.
maybe not on the explicit format command, but on the like other places where package.json is in fact reformatted. That's where I would want the config settings to always win.
Right. You want them to be respected wherever we're touching.
Yes.
I feel like that makes sense.
Yeah, that,
Go ahead.
oh, yeah, I was just gonna say that was my use case too, of if I had packages somewhere that I had weird stuff in, I would want like a top level config that I could go and ensure that anything that I wrote was gonna get updated with my personal config values.
Apologize, just taking notes. Guard, did you have a?
I was just thinking through what it means as a contributor to open source projects to go clone a repo now. I'm Luke, I've got them set so that when I'm doing things and I want to, add a feature that needs a new dependency, my configs are going to obliterate their package JSON, right?
That's exactly why whatever's in the file should always be authoritative, unless you explicitly say, I wish to reformat this file.
What do you mean by if you clone a repo, there's probably
let's
going to
say,
be an npm RC
okay.
file in there with.
No, let's say Luke and I have differing opinions, right? And he's got a global npm config so that whenever he touches his things, they conform to what he wants. Okay. I do the same and mine's different than his. And I want to add to his repo now. I want to clone one of his projects, add, a library and use it for a new feature. My settings are going to obliterate his package JSON.
If you don't want to have global settings affecting project level, then you should find the project level config.
But that means that puts the onus on all developers to lock everything down in the project level. That's onerous.
I also think that if you're setting that at a global level, like you're making the choice that if I go and clone this repo, I'm gonna have to figure that, like I'm gonna have to address that. I think that like by going to that state of opting into that, you're also taking on the onus of I'm gonna have to deal with this sometimes and like fix my Git commits.
There's a very simple solution to this, which is the only thing that reformats your package JSON is npm pkg format. If there's an existing package JSON and it has tabs, and you do npm install foo, and your personal settings say no, I wish to use spaces, it uses tabs because the file's already tabs, and we're editing a file. We're not creating a new file. If we create a new file, okay, we use the configs. If you explicitly say npm pkg format, we use the configs.
So could we have the format command have an option passed to it that doesn't actually rewrite the file, but exits with a status code that indicates 0 if it did not need to be rewritten and 1. Yeah, perfect. Because then I can just stick that in CI for all my packages, and then at least I'll be reminded to manually run the format command instead of, instead of trying to rely on it happening every time I touch a repo. Does that seem?
That seems reasonable, yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, and just to enable more workflows, we should probably have a dry run like format that actually outputs the file to standard out as well.
Well, and real quick for dry run, I'm not sure if that's actually what I want, because dry run is usually like do the same stuff, but don't actually do anything destructive. So like if npm package format would succeed, I would expect dry run of it to succeed and exit 0. This is a like check. Like this is basically like error if you were gonna do something destructive, pass if you weren't gonna, but don't do the destructive thing either way. So it's like dry run plus change the exit code.
So it's like validate. So it's like npm.
It's like validate, yeah.
Yeah. So you want you want validate.
Yeah, and the git status stuff that Isaac just posted in chat, that is the hack everyone has to do now, and that really sucks because it's relatively trivial for the first command to exit non-zero, and then like, because eventually you have to put a cleanup somewhere in there, and it's a big pain in the butt to figure out a way to do that that's actually robust and will happen even when the commands fail. So I think an explicit validate thing is great, but npm package validate I would expect to validate many more things besides just the indentation format. Like I would expect that to validate the schema, and that's a much broader discussion.
Yeah, I just recently wrote a CI step in the CLI project that use that git status,
Yeah, I mean, ESLint does this sort of by default, but anyone who's using Prettier by themselves has had to deal with this problem many times. And similarly, I have tools that auto-generate like tables of contents or lists of things in documentation, like perhaps NPM's auto-generated documentation sections. And you have to manually jump through a bunch of hoops to make sure that people have remembered to run those commands.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it'd be nice to, perfect.
So just to capture action items, and I'm putting a lot on Luke here to hopefully update this or conceptualize these two added features, flags. I think there is value in the dry run and the validate potentially as flags to format. So if we can potentially just even scaffold that or add to the conversation back, Luke, that'd be great. This feedback, and then it sounds like there isn't an appetite to like turn this into RFC. We should probably just go ahead and backlog work item to actually like do the work here. So if we can, let's turn this into actually like a ticket, turn this into a backlog.
The other thing was you asked about maybe it can output to a file as well, or to standard out. It seems really nice if this command, if npm package format could detect that it's in a pipe, and when it's in a pipe, spew the output to standard out, and when it's not, it writes it to the disk, because then it sort of automatically matches the user's intent. Because otherwise, why would you pipe it? Just a thought.
I think I saw that in the Slack channel as well, or on another command specifically. MPX,
yeah, it was.
I'm picking up where that thought is coming from. Okay.
More broadly speaking, you mentioned like dry run is do the same thing and output the same output, but just don't make the destructive changes. We actually should be outputting a little bit more useful stuff in a bunch of dry run cases. Like if you do npm install dry run and we say 10 packages were installed, it's like, okay, well, thanks a lot. that sure did help me. It'd be a lot nicer if that like told you what the diff would have been, right? Like, especially with stuff like npm audit fix dry run. Like it doesn't help you because it doesn't tell you what was supposed to be done. So having npm pkg format dry run like exit non-zero if it would have made changes, actually fine. Like that seems perfectly reasonable to me. Or even have it output a diff.
Yeah. So I added those two notes. Anything else on this, or can we move forward? I think we can leave the RFC open for now. And then Luke, if you're okay with it, essentially turning this into a ticket in our team's backlog.
Yep, that sounds great.
Cool. Thanks. And I know you're excited about this because you've been using tooling, ecosystem tooling for this for a while. So cool. Moving on to issue number 371. This is a feature essentially that's queued up in our backlog that was spun out of a RFC by Roy Adorno. We essentially backlogged the work for creating a new mechanism for either including or excluding the root of your project for essentially when you're using workspaces. Gar, I think you've been working on this. I'm not sure if there's an update here that you want to share.
Well, but I can describe the problem space here. As we developed this, we realized that there was kind of a quirk with how we implement workspaces. And that is, by default, workspaces are enabled in that Arborist will use them. Like if you install package A and have a workspace package name A, Arborist is going to use that, right? So in that sense, workspaces are enabled. But when we went to implement workspaces as a flag, enabling workspaces then came to mean do this thing in all my workspaces. So there's this weird like quirk in that mental model. And so we didn't have a way to say to that first step, hey, Arborist, don't even use the workspaces when you install, right? Disabling workspaces altogether versus the default, which is don't run these commands in all my workspaces. That's half of this. The other half is we also, now that we've got this way to say, hey, go do this in all my workspaces, we want a way to say, also do it in my root. So that if, you know, the example is like npm repo -- workspaces -- include root, I would get the repo of my root and all my workspaces. So that kind of completes the loop and covers the gap on the kind of holes in the mental model of what it means to enable workspaces, totally disable them, and how do I include my root project in the base command when I'm doing it. So that's the problem space that we're solving there.
Any feedback, or Gar, essentially you're doing the work to enable this. You've outlined the flags, which should be net new to folks since we kind of discussed those internally. What might be interesting is no workspaces are essentially the trinary of that concept, where by default workspaces is null, I think is accurate. Is that accurate? The config workspaces is null. There's now, okay.
That's how we functionally solved that problem of, by default, workspaces are disabled in that you're not going to run the command in all the workspaces, but there was no way to also explicitly tell Arborist, don't look in the workspaces when you reify. And that's what explicitly setting workspaces default covers that last gap. Leaving it the default will do what it does now, which is if I do npm install, Arborist will look in workspaces for reification.
Any feedback on this? This is more of a, I think you brought this up or added to the agenda just for visibility, right?
Yeah, just to let you know, this is where we landed, and this is, unless someone sees a problem with this, there's already a PR in the CLI for it, but I have to go land it in Arborist before that CLI can land, because it needs to be able to pay attention to these flags appropriately. Your silence is golden.
I apologize, I'm just taking notes. Do you know the PR, or can you reference the PR? So I can add it to our notes as well.
I'll find it. 3587. There will also need to be an Arborist one.
Yep.
And Jordan, this is the one that used to be the other flag, and then we talked through it, and then once we realized that the root problem was this trinary, this is where we landed on. So thanks for helping think through that.
Okay.
In the interest of completeness here, we did also explore this, like in this kind of cute way of saying, well, what if you could do like -- workspace equals dot, which seemed like it would be nicer because we're like, oh, then we don't need the trinary, which is always a pain and, you know, kind of hard to reason about. And then it's like, oh, the root is just like, it's just another workspace. So it's like the same kind of thing. It turns out it's not the same kind of thing. So yeah, that was incredibly hard to get working properly and super complicated to the point where we're like, actually, no, just there needs to be an explicit thing that says include workspace root. It's verbose and gnarly, but it's also really straightforward and hard to mess up.
To be clear, I think this is because of the architectural changes NPM has made by hoisting everything to the top. Lerna uses dot. It works perfectly fine in my experience anyway. But every time I've said something works fine in Lerna, Lerna's maintainer tells me it's terrible. So like, but at least in my experience, the dot has worked fine. But that's because
we would have made it work fine. No. For you.
But like each sub project in a Lerna monorepo has its own node modules, and things are put in it and not always hoisted to the top. So I think that those architecture changes sort of constrain and determine a lot of this stuff. So it's fine if that's not what this flavor of workspaces can do. I think the dot would work just fine in the alternative, perhaps superior form of workspaces we've discussed a bunch of times in this call. But yeah, obviously this is fine for now, just as long as the functionality is there.
It's not so much about hoisting. It's about not having very well or any defined semantics for nested workspaces. So a workspace may not contain other workspaces. But if dot is a workspace, now we have a workspace that we're sort of treating semantically, conceptually.
Can you qualify it? When you say the word workspace, I still have no idea what you're talking about.
A workspace is the thing that is referenced by the workspaces designation in the package.json
So the
file.
child one, not the root.
Child.
So if we're saying that the root is a workspace in the sense that you can do -- workspace equals dot, now we have something that we're calling a workspace, but it has workspaces within it. It contains further workspaces.
And no root.
Right. And doesn't have, and its workspace root is itself. So like, okay. That's just like hard in the model that we have. Like we could paper over it. I mean, but it's like, there's a level at which we're papering over too much. This is just a doorway.
Well, I think there's a large collection of commands where it's not an issue, because if I'm saying npm run foo and I'm running the foo script, that is completely unambiguous whether the package JSON I'm running it against is a child or a root workspace. But there are surely a lot of npm commands where the difficulty you're talking about comes up. And the way to paper over it is to throw an error or define a semantic, and it wouldn't be consistent. So I understand the challenge.
Right. So,
real quick, the specific thing I find valuable in the dot though is the ability to put it in config, meaning I can actually say, like in my Lerna config in my only Lerna monorepo, I say like when I'm running this specific Lerna command, run it on dot also, so that I could say Lerna build and it runs the build script in the child projects and also in the root project, and that is precisely what I want. With a command line invocation, it would not be so trivial.
It's a config item though. Include workspace root, turn it on.
Yeah, the same thing. And in fact, it's even more explicit because you don't have to know that dot is like the pseudo workspace. It's also the root, and it has mostly the same semantics. It's just a Boolean. Right. It's like, do you want to do it on the root or not? If we did eventually want to say that we support nested workspaces, so you can have a workspace which has child workspaces underneath it, then we'd be crossing that bridge from, the 0, 1 infinity bridge would be going that third step. And at that point, saying dot is a workspace wouldn't be that big a bullet to bite, because it would be, well, workspaces can contain workspaces. That's normal, right? But that's not the world we're in. You get one level of workspaces, that's it, not infinity.
Okay. I know that we had an action item that we should probably review the last few meetings. Specifically, I remember there was an action item to update the terminology and definitions, and then potentially add like a glossary for the RFC, the workspaces RFC, the original one. And I continue to reference this one image that I threw together to try to help ensure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about this terminology. But I want to get to the last item here before I'm going to ask for some maybe updates around the audit improvements or the 3 RFCs that we have open around that space. Alistair, this is your PR for peer dependencies should be able to match the full range of pre-release versions. I remember that we left this open for an extra week or so. Just wanted to know if there was any updates or that you want to share around this.
So the only updates I've got really with the hopefully a little bit more specific use case, or dive into some personas. So I left some comments on the RFC for that, as well as some suggestions based on the previous meeting we discussed it in. One of them happened to be the idea that if a user provided a pre-release version as a peer dependency, and they also had a they provided a pre-release version. Let me get this right. They provided a pre-release version of a peer dependency, and they also had that pre-release version in the tree. Then it would automatically resolve. But it comes up, I couldn't see a problem with that necessarily. Otherwise, it would fail today or install the wrong version. So, but it comes down to the what we discussed earlier on in the meeting around user intent. So it's like, okay, we can automatically assume that this is a good thing, but we never know if it is or not. But it seems like it would be preferable for, if you have a 400-0 in your pre-releases. So you've got a plugin that depends on a library for pre-release, and then you have that library installed at 400-0. Then it would be like, okay, I got that peer dependency. And I don't try and install a different one as a peer, or fail. It's like, okay, you've got that dependency installed. It's a different version. I won't install it. That's the current behavior, I think. The alternative is for that package, and I'm specifically saying the plugin here. So the thing that has the peer dependency, that would define some sort of peer dependency meta that says I match these, when you install me, allow the peer dependency to resolve pre-releases if you've installed a pre-release version of that dependency. And yeah, the reason for those specific suggestions, so in the previous discussion, it came up that maybe the plugin developers or should be forced to publish a version which has that pre-release as a peer dependency. But if you've got an ecosystem where you've got hundreds of dependencies, it's not really like something you'd really want. If you I refer to my personas in the ticket, you're a developer of the main library that has these plugins. You want to test a pre-release version using an existing set of plugins, and suddenly you've got to publish every single version you're testing with. And let's say that a user of the library, they want to test that there's a new change and it would work before absorbing that version finally, or the versions that the plugins that they're using, whether it's a version from the library maintainer, their own plugin, or someone else's plugin, they can't test that pre-release version of the main library without somehow hacking together those plugins.
It sounds like in that specific use case, it potentially overrides would allow for this. That use case, or no?
Overrides would, but if overrides is such a powerful tool that it will probably satisfy an awful lot of use cases that we maybe just don't want to pin on overrides as the solution for. It would be handy to have an include pre-releases flag that you could pass to NPM, and then every semver.satisfies invocation would just throw that onto it. So you could install your -0 version of the library with that flag set, and while building the tree in that particular case, in that particular instance of NPM, while building that tree, it would be allowing pre-releases. So treating pre-releases as just a nothing special in the semver satisfies call.
I think the main problem there, okay, maybe when you're installing like foo, for example, here, I think the problem there is a little bit too vague, maybe. Like, you don't want everything to just suddenly be treated as or allow pre-releases when installing. You'd want these specific dependencies that you've got in your tree, or that you've got in your package JSON that are pre-releases to match if there's a peer which also
so that's actually what that would have that effect if you're installing one package and doing include pre-releases, because the rest of your tree is fine and it won't be touched if you're just installing one deb.
But a future npm install would
exactly.
error out, wouldn't it?
A future npm install would treat that as an invalid dependency and fix it. Yeah. So it's useful for testing, but you're not going to end up being, caught with, including pre-releases forever. It's sort of not a commitment.
I see your hands up.
My questions were basically about clarifying what Isaac was saying, that no, it would only be that dependency for this install that would even get the semver test. And potentially it's children, but they, aren't going to have pre-releases in their latest unless they do. So I think that seems to me like it solves the use case of testing, and it's fine that it won't carry forward because the use case here is the testing, right? And this solves the exact user story that as I read it. So
say it depends. When you're testing, it doesn't necessarily mean just a single run on the system. You could be building something to, I say deploy, but you're building something, you move it somewhere and you run it. Or you're building a Docker file, for example.
A long-running integration branch of the upcoming version of a peer dependency.
Yeah. I want to define something in my package JSON, which will be, I say reproducible. It's not reproducible because the package lock's there, but I think you get the idea. Something I can define and install and get what I want, rather than something that only lasts intermittently via a single command. Like I want to create an app that, and similarly, if I want multiple dependencies which have this this issue, I happen to have two dependencies which pre-release, then it becomes impossible to build that tree correctly, because you've either got one or the other and it'll fail on one.
So I just checked and I realized that I misspoke. Whatever's in package-lock.json, if you do npm install with no arguments, whatever's in the package-lock.json will be the ideal tree, unless the root project has or one of your workspaces has an invalid dependency. So if you do npm install foo at 123-4 -- include pre-releases, anything that peer depends on it will be treated as just fine. Anything that depends on foo 1.x will be just fine. Then it will be in the lock file. It'll also be saved with the version range in your package.json. If later you just do npm install with no arguments, you'll get what's in the lock file. You'll get the -4 version and it will be fine. If you ran npm ls-a, it would report some problems, but okay, that's fine. You got to ls with include pre-releases also. But I think this might actually be the solution, and that a solution to this use case that sidesteps the sort of a very surprising hazard of semvers are treated differently depending on the kind of dependency that it is. That's what I'm kind of trying to avoid. I'm trying to get us out of doing, because it's a sort of buried semantic switch.
So we have to wrap. Unfortunately, we're a couple minutes over already. I want to keep this open for now and allow folks to give some feedback, just based on the fact that I feel like we're going back and forth here, and I apologize there wasn't a lot of time at the end, Alistair. In terms of the audit improvements, if we can get just async updates added in those threads themselves for folks. I know ZB had been adding some PRs to Arborist and to the CLI itself for some action items that he needed for the NPM audit resolver package. Unfortunately, he's not in this call today. And Tierney, if you can provide some updates, maybe async. I know you're keeping up to date with those two RFCs. So, and I've also taken an action item here to circle back on the previous discussions. I know we had items associated with further defining and declaring essentially our definitions, our NPM's definitions around workspace terminology. So I've taken that away. Appreciate everybody jumping on today. Apologize we didn't have more time, and hopefully we'll see you next week. It'll be at the same time, same place. And yeah, thank you. Cheers.